Hello, everyone. Welcome to Total Football Talk. I hope you like the new intro. Maybe it's a better way of putting it is the old new intro. I'm here to talk about it's a special little clip. There's going to be two videos posted today, one this morning and then one this afternoon or this evening with Eric. The Total Football Talk episode airing with Eric today is going to be covering the Rams schedule. And not necessarily a prediction show for the rest of the league, but kind of an overall prediction without seeing any preseason games where we think both the Rams and Bears are going to end up. I'm not doing any other teams. I'm also going to talk about why so many people hate the New England Patriots, and it's not because they don't like a winner, which is an article that I read from Lindy's Pro Football Magazine, which the magazines for footballs are starting to come out. Remember, guys, I recommend Street Smith, but if you're going to get a magazine and your options are Lindsay's, Athlon, or Street Smith, I'll go Street Smith. They are definitely a better brand, and I'm doing that without them paying me to say that, so that should tell you what I think. Now, what is today's show? What is this morning's show? This morning's show is going to cover the 1980 Los Angeles Rams as a whole. Now, I'm going to do another segment later on where I'm going to break down each individual season and talk about them. This is more of an overview of the season and kind of where the Rams finished and placed. You know, it's going to have a little bit of a Ram bent, but ultimately I want to give credence to what I believe, and I'm not saying this because, you know, it was the decade I grew up in. To be honest with you, it wasn't the decade I grew up in. I was 10 years old by 1989. So for me, the 1980s, as I look back on it, I can say this. I grew up in the 90s. Really, the 90s was the decade I grew up in. But I got to tell you guys, I still think to this day the 1980s decade as a whole is probably the single greatest decade in the history of professional football. And I don't mean that in a hyperbolic sense. I don't mean that, in a theoretical sense. I'm going to back up why I say it's the greatest decade in the history of professional football. And it really stems from the absolute beginning. So when you get into the 1980 season, the Raiders, the Rams, the Cowboys, the Vikings, the Steelers, and the Dolphins, right? Those are what I call the go-to five in the 1980s. Again, Rams, Vikings, Cowboys, okay? Raiders, Steelers. Those are the go-to five. The Dolphins would have made it the go-to six if they didn't have such a lull. As far as championship appearances after 73. They didn't make it again and really weren't ever close. So, but they lost a lot of their players. But really, I called it the not the go-to six because that's what we have today. I called it, the powerhouse five. And you could really call it the powerhouse six because, again, the Dolphins, they did make it to the championship game in 71, 72, 73, right? In 74, they lost a really close game to the Oakland Raiders, the Sea of Hands game. So, they had their run where they were really a top-notch football program, but only for 4 of the 10 years. So that's why I call it the powerhouse five. Now, during the 70s and this time period, it really was either the Raiders or Steelers were going to go to the Super Bowl in the AFC, and in the NFC, it was either going to be the Cowboys, the Rams, or the Vikings. Now, as the decade unfolded, the Rams started to become more and more of the choke artist, unfortunately. And although some could argue the 70s was the Rams' greatest decade, and I cannot argue that. In fact, I would be stupid too, and I think so would you. You can love on the 50s all you want, and I know they won a championship in 51, but it doesn't compare to the tenured success of the Rams in the 70s and how much in the picture they were year in and year out. But as the 70s ended, right, because in the 70s you had the Steelers in the Super Bowl 4 times, you had the Raiders in the Super Bowl once, so and then the Dolphins were in the Super Bowl 3 times, right? So between those 3 AFC teams, only the Colts and the Broncos made the Super Bowl. In the NFC, you had the Vikings in the playoffs 3 times. You had the Cowboys in the playoffs 4 times, right? So And then you had the Rams in the Super Bowl, not the playoffs, but the Super Bowl. You had the Rams in the Super Bowl once. So again, in that decade, only the Redskins and give me a minute. I'm trying to think. In 1970, it was the Cowboys and Colts. 71, it was the Cowboys and Dolphins. Dolphins and Redskins. Dolphins and Vikings. Steelers and Vikings. Cowboys and Steelers. That was it. So the Cowboys did it 5 times. My apologies. The Cowboys made it 5 times. The Vikings made it 3 times. And the Rams made it once. So you talk about that. I mean, only the Redskins were the only other team that decade in the NFC to make the Super Bowl. So out of the Powerhouse 5, only 3 teams made the Super Bowl. So it's interesting to think about. So as the 70s wrapped up, much like they do every decade, they kind of figured a lot of those teams would still carry over. And Dallas in the first half of the decade was still really relevant. The Vikings had already fallen off the wagon, and people were kind of waiting to see about the Rams because they were getting up there in age and there was a transition period, and people kind of thought that was the beginning of the end for the LA Rams. The Steelers, people were still high on, but it was clear they were getting old, and the Raiders, were in this weird flux where they were winning, but they were losing. So the 80s made it very clear at the onset of 1980 that it was going to be wide open for everyone. And it was anyone for the taking. No one expected the team of the decade to be an abysmal franchise that had only won 2 games in 79 and 78, 4 games total in 2 years, 6 games total in 3 years. A lot of people kind of, at the success of the Niners and Bill Walsh, to give them credit where credit's due, it really kind of floored a lot of people. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. 1978 and 1979 was life after John Madden for the Oakland Raiders. After the 1977 season, actually, I take that back. After the 1978 season, John Madden retired. In 1979, the Raiders got a new coach and they started a new era. But 78 and 79, the Raiders were not making the playoffs and they were not the same old Raiders. So come the 1980 season, nobody really had them picked to come back strong. Now, the 1980 season is interesting. The Rams are dethroned as NFC Western champs for the first time in 7 years by a team with the exact same record as they had, and a team that the Rams beat in week 16, which at that time was the final week of the regular season, in overtime. But due to conference record or division record, the Falcons edged out the Rams to win the division. To me, this breaks my heart a little bit because the Rams, that 11-5 Ram team, in a lot of ways, was better than the Atlanta Falcons. They overcame a lot more than the Atlanta Falcons did. And I think if they played Dallas at home in the divisional playoff round, I think it could have been a very different result than it was when the Rams went to Dallas. However you want to look at it, the 1980 playoff picture broke down as this. Philly was the 1 seed. Atlanta was the 2 seed. And then I believe, yes, the Vikings won the Central. And then the Rams and Cowboys were your wild card teams. Now, the Rams had beaten the pee out of Dallas earlier that year on Monday night, and it was a beautiful thing to watch. I have that game. I highly recommend it. But as the wild card broke down, it became painstakingly clear that the Rams couldn't stop the run, and Tony Dorsett was going to have himself a day. When everything broke down and ended out, Dallas wins rather handily, and they're going to go play Atlanta. Now, the interesting thing about Atlanta is in 1978, I believe, the Dallas Cowboys had beaten the Atlanta Falcons in comeback fashion. Roger Staubach goes down with an injury. Danny White comes in and saves the day. Well, now Danny White's the starting quarterback. And don't you know, his first divisional game, his first playoff games against the Rams, of course, why wouldn't it be? The very team that eliminated Dallas the year before. But Dallas ends up beating Atlanta in a close game, and they go to Philly. Philly had beaten Minnesota earlier that year, or earlier in the divisional round. So they play each other in the championship game. Now, in the AFC, things are breaking down the way a lot of people kind of thought they would. The Chargers won the West. The Cleveland Browns had surprised not everyone because they had a strong 79, had won the North or the Central at the time. And the East was won by I believe it was, correct me if I'm wrong here, I want to say the Bills or the Dolphins. I think it was the Dolphins. Anyway, so the way it broke down was the Raiders and the Oilers were the wild card team, as were the Raiders. So the Raiders played Houston in the wild card round. The Chargers did play Buffalo. It was Buffalo in 1980. Buffalo won the East under Chuck Knox, former Ram head coach. The Chargers beat the Bills to host the championship game. The Raiders had beaten the Oilers for the right to go, and the Oilers, third year in a row, they were the wild card team. So the first 3 years of the wild card's existence in the AFC, Oilers, Oilers, Oilers. And it was the first time the Oilers had lost the wild card game. So Houston is out, and the Raiders advance to Cleveland in that infamous red right 88 play that cost the Raiders the game, or the Browns the game. The Raiders get the interception, and they go on to the championship game to play the Chargers. In a great game, the Raiders had this huge lead, and the Raiders came, not a huge lead, but a good lead. The Raiders came back and preserved the victory. Now, a lot of people had predicted that it was going to be Chargers-Cowboys in the NFC, in the Super Bowl. Philly had been in the wild card game 3 years in a row, much like the Oilers. And this time they were the division winner, and they had gotten to the championship game for the first time since 1960. The Eagles beat the Cowboys in a lot of people thought was a huge upset, and beat them kind of handily, 20-7, on a very cold day at the Vet. And the Raiders beat the Chargers, so we got this really unique matchup. The Raiders, who had only at the time won one Super Bowl, and this was their third. Philly, who had never been. So you had kind of this old versus new establishment happening. And a lot of people were high on Philly, but at the end of the day, the Raiders pulled the upset and won big 27-10 to win the season. But 1980 wasn't the telltale sign of the decade, and no one would have thought that. You get to 1981, and this 49er team that had been 6-10 in 1980, 2-14, 2-14, 4-12. So they had won in 1980. They won 6 games, which was more than they had won the previous 2 seasons combined, and almost as many as they had won the previous 3 seasons combined. But nobody saw the 49ers coming. Now, I can't say nobody saw the Bengals coming, and here's why. Cincinnati was one of those teams that was always good. They almost made the playoffs in 76. They had kind of a downturn 78, 79, and 80, but a lot of people knew that there was injuries and there were other reasons playing into a part of that. So the Bengals making the playoffs in 1981 didn't surprise anybody, or at least people that were paying attention. Going 12-4, however, did surprise a lot of people. The Niners had gone 13-3. Dallas won the East at 12-4. The Buccaneers won the North. And then you had your wild card teams was the Giants and the Eagles. So clearly the NFC East is showing its establishment, its power. But there's still, Dallas is still relevant. In the AFC, the Bengals won the North. The Chargers won the West. The Dolphins had won the East. And the Bills and Jets had made the playoffs. So a lot of people were kind of like, oh, this could be interesting. Now, the Bills beat the Jets to advance to the divisional playoff game. Ironically, to play Buffalo, and I'll say ironically why in a minute. Cincinnati. In the AFC, the Giants had beaten Philly in a crazy, wacky game at the Vet, and the Giants would go to San Francisco, which means Dallas would play Tampa Bay. Wasn't even close, 31-0. And the 49ers would play the Giants in a game that, LT was, on the Giants at this point. But the Giants were still not there yet. Parcells isn't coach. There's still a lot of issues, but the Giants are there. And the 49ers handle their business in advance. And everyone expected it to be Dallas and San Francisco, rematch of the 70 and 71 championship game. And it was. What was a surprise to people was that the 49ers had won the game. And of course, we know by now, living in 2019, Dwight Clark, the catch, the come from behind. But the thing that blows me away about that game is the amount of turnovers the 49ers had in that game. I think they committed something like 5 turnovers in that game and still won the game. If the 49ers had played a clean game, I don't know that the Cowboys are in the game. But, what if, right? Shoulda, woulda, coulda, however you want to look at it. The end of the story is Dallas has the lead and the 49ers score the winning touchdown with 58 seconds left, right? That's the sad part. That's where everyone says it's over. It's not over. The Cowboys get this huge completion to Tony Hill. And back in that day, they had just done away with the tearaway jerseys for the 1980 season. So 79 was the last year of the tearaway jerseys. If the tearaway jersey was still in existence, the Bengals and Cowboys are playing in the Super Bowl in Super Bowl 16. And history looks very different. But it doesn't matter. They don't have the tearaway jerseys. They get tackled at midfield. So now Dallas is at midfield with about 38 seconds to go. Actually, the 49 or 45-yard line. Another big completion, burn a tee, or spike the ball rather because they're out of timeouts, kick the field goal and go home with a victory. But as it would turn out, the 49ers sack Danny White. I believe he fumbles. The 49ers recover, and the game is over. Go watch that championship game because so much more happens after Dwight Clark's catch that it deserves to be watched. Now, in the AFC side of things, as I said, the Bengals are going to play the Bills. They're going to handle business. Ironically, I believe the score was 21-10. And again, it's the same score to the championship game 7 years later. The Dolphins have this epic game against the San Diego Chargers that the Chargers win. And it's just an amazing game. But it took everything the Chargers had right out of them. So for the second year in a row, the Chargers are in the championship game. The first year they hosted. This time they got to go to Cincinnati in what is still considered, if not the coldest, one of the coldest games of all time. It was colder than the Ice Bowl, to give you an idea how cold it was in Cincinnati. But the Bengals handle business and win 27-7. But the Super Bowl, to me, is really, really amazing. And the reason it's really, really amazing is the 49ers are up 20-0 at halftime, and they only win the game 26-21. Yeah, 26-20, 26-21, something like that. It's a phenomenally close Super Bowl at the end. A goal line stand, several Bengal turnovers, and an onside kick that failed at the end of the game is ultimately what upended the Cincinnati Bengals' upset bid and come from behind victory. What I want to note here in 1981 is something unique happened. Now, in 1981, the Washington Redskins hired somebody by the name of Joe Gibbs, who was going to completely change the landscape of the NFL in the 1980s. Now, the Washington Redskins opened the season 0-5. They had lost their 4 preseason games and lost their first 5 regular season games. Joe Gibbs was 0-9 out the gate. And again, preseason doesn't count. After that, however, the Washington Redskins would go 8-3 down the rest of the season and the season 8-8. A really great come-from-behind season for the Redskins and a prelude of things to come that maybe some people saw but didn't really know if they could expect. But they all did it without John Riggins. Now, 1982 to me is fascinating. 1982 is fascinating. I'm going to do this in 2 parts, and I'm going to post them in 2 parts. So you want to keep an eye open. But in 1982, the Rams at this point, let me cover the Rams real quick in 81. So the Rams in 81 are decimated with injuries. They have several issues, none, in my opinion, bigger than the fact that their quarterback, Pat Hayden, got injured and Vince Ferragamo wasn't on the team. So the Rams have this weird position where they have a running back that's old, that's fumbling the ball in Wendell Tyler. They have no quarterback, and their defense is getting older. A lot of people were kind of saying, put the fork in the Rams, they're done. In 1982, the Rams didn't get much better, but Ferragamo did return, which was a big lift for the Rams offense. But more importantly, it became painstakingly clear that the Rams had no playmakers on the offensive side of the ball. This would be Wendell Tyler's last year with the Rams. He only rushed, and he did rush for 564 yards in a strike-shortened season. They only played 9 games. But Wendell Tyler wasn't good enough to execute what the Rams needed moving forward. and certainly wasn't going to help the Rams with their new head coach coming in. After the 1982 season, the Rams fire Ray Malavasi. Tough decision. Man led him to a Super Bowl and a playoff in 1980. He had a great year in 78, was coach of the year, won 2 division titles. But at the end of the day, when you look at the body of work under Ray Malavasi, they're 12-4 in 78. They're 9-7 in 79, right? Decimated with injuries. Both seasons, especially the championship game in 78. In 80, they go 11-5 despite some injuries and some overcoming. They still can't figure out their quarterback situation. And they're predictable. They're like running the same plays for the 3rd year in a row on defense and offense, and people are starting to figure it out. By 1981, again decimated with injuries, the Rams go 6-10. In 1982, again decimated by injuries, and the Rams go 2-7. So I always said, if your coach can't keep your team healthy, it doesn't matter what he does with the depth. You got to stay healthy. There's something going on in LA, and they ended up giving him the boot. Now, it should be mentioned as well that 1980 and 1982, the first 2 years that the first 2 years that the Rams were in Anaheim. So their last year in the Coliseum was, actually, that's not true. 79 was their last year in the Coliseum. 80, 81, and 82 were their first 3 years in Anaheim, and the fans didn't like the direction things were going. And Anaheim's really not Los Angeles. If you live in the LA area, you know what I'm talking about. So a lot of fans were pissed off and not coming out. So between poor attendance, between a bland and plain offense, a predictable defense, an aging unit, the Rams really had to do something. So they went and they got themselves a Southern Cal coach by the name of John Robinson, and they got themselves a really dynamic offensive player in the 1983 draft, which we'll get to in a minute. But 82 was kind of the last of the pain because the Rams would lose several games here. They had a 21-0 lead on the Green Bay Packers and ended up losing 35-23. Against the Lions, they were up 14-6 and ended up losing 19-14. Against the Falcons, they were never in the game. Against the Chiefs, that was a good game back and forth. The Rams ended up winning in traditional fashion. Against the 49ers, the Rams kept turning the ball over and could not overcome a 10-point deficit to start that game. Against the Denver Broncos, the Rams blew a 21-7 lead. Against the Oakland Raiders, the Rams blew 2 10-point leads to lose in overtime to the now Los Angeles Raiders. The Bears, the Rams couldn't stop to save their life, and Chicago wasn't exactly a dynamic offense. Jim McMahon had a field day. Vince Ferragamo had a field day, but at the end of the day, the Rams lost 34-26. And then at the end of the year, they only beat the 49ers because of a blocked extra point at the end of the game that would have forced overtime to give them their second and only other win at 21-20. But it did eliminate the 49ers from the playoffs, so that made it a good conclusion to the season. Now, what about the 1982 season? Well, the 1982 season, because it's strike shortened, you're going to have a whole different playoff breakdown. There are no division winners, so they go by seeding. So the Redskins are the 1 seed, the Cowboys are the 2 seed, the Packers are the 3 seed, the Vikings are the 4 seed. And then you've got the Buccaneers, the Falcons, the Cardinals, and the Lions that all make the playoffs as road teams. They're the bottom 4. The Lions end up losing to the Washington Redskins, who are the 1 seed. The Cardinals end up losing to the Green Bay Packers, who were the 3 seed. The Buccaneers, who were really the 7 seed, ended up losing to the Dallas Cowboys. And the Atlanta Falcons ended up losing to the Minnesota Vikings. So all the home teams in the NFC won, which made it interesting because now we go to the second round. The second round pitted Green Bay against Dallas and Minnesota against Washington. And again, the home teams prevailed. So much so was the excitement in Washington that fans were actually, of the Redskins, were actually at the Cowboy game rooting for Dallas to win so they would play the Redskins in the NFC Championship game. I know, people are crazy. I know you Bear fans are shaking your head going, we'd never do that with Green Bay. Well, the Redskins got what they wanted. They played Dallas in the championship game, and they beat them. Now, the game was 31-17, but at one point it got uncomfortable. But after Danny White gets knocked out of the game, but ultimately Huggaboom can't do much, and the Washington Redskins prevail. But this is the 3rd year in a row now the Dallas Cowboys have made it to the conference championship game. And if you really want to be technical, it's the 5th time in 6 years that they've made it to the conference championship game. And it's the 7th time in 8 years The 9th time in 10 years that the Dallas Cowboys have made it to the conference championship game, or the 9th time in 11 years. So it is interesting, to say the very least. But Washington beats them. It does not kill the Cowboy dynasty. They are still going to be favored in 83, and they're still going to be a force to be reckoned with. In the AFC, the Dolphins were the 1 seed. The Raiders were the 2 seed. The Bengals were the 3 seed. I'm sorry, the Raiders were the 1 seed. The Dolphins were the 2 seed. The Bengals were the 3 seed. Pittsburgh was the 4 seed. And then you had the Jets, the Steelers, Patriots, and Browns all make the playoffs. The Raiders would beat Cleveland again for the 2nd time in 3 years, this time in LA. The Patriots, after beating New England early in the year, or Miami earlier in the year 3-0, would lose to Miami in Miami. And the Jets would go into Cincinnati and pull the upset and beat the Bengals. But the upsets don't end there. The Jets then go to Los Angeles, and they upset the Los Angeles Raiders to advance to the AFC Championship game. The Dolphins play the Chargers in a rematch and beat them. It's nowhere near the same type of game. And then Miami in the mud and the slop beat the Jets 14-0 to go to Super Bowl 17, where they played the Washington Redskins in a great, great game. Close contest. Now, there's a couple subtle things that are going on in the 1980s that people aren't paying attention to. The Bears are getting really good. They get a new coach in Mike Ditka. Jim McMahon is starting to establish himself. Walter Payton is still great as ever. Buddy Ryan is establishing his defense down in Chicago. And the Bears are starting to get pieces to the puzzle as they're moving along. The Redskins are now they've officially now arrived. And the New York Giants are now having to hire a new coach in Bill Parcells in 1983. And that's going to pay dividends. The 49ers, they've been out of it after the 82 season. A lot of people were like, well, maybe the 49ers were just a fluke, nothing to worry about. Don't worry about the 49ers. That 1983 draft is the greatest draft in NFL history. Again, I'm going into this because I want to make it very clear how great the 80s were. So 80, you've got this free-for-all for the Super Bowl. In 81, you've got this, no one saw this coming, and no one took it seriously. In 82, you've kind of got a rematch of a Super Bowl of old, an old classic in the Redskins coming back into the forefront, an old classic in the Cowboys staying dominant. Pittsburgh's back in the picture after a year out. Things are looking like, well, maybe these teams are still going to be here in the end. The big thing is that the Dolphins are back in the AFC, and people are excited about that. In 1980, there's a few games I want you guys to look at. The Raiders at Philadelphia in a cold game at the Vet. Philly wins it. It's a great game if you like defense. The AFC Championship game is a great game if you like offense. Obviously, the marathon in Miami, the double overtime game. But I would also argue that both Ram-Falcon games in the regular season was worth the ticket of admission if you want to see a really good game. In 1982, man, the Rams-Raiders, there are so many good games in that strike-shortened season, you could really take your pick. 83, business picks up because the draft is phenomenal. All 28 teams at some point in that draft got themselves a superstar marquee player to help solidify their football team. Every single one of them. Never happened before in NFL history. I don't know if it'll ever happen again. That's how deep that draft was. Our beloved Rams got Eric Dickerson. But the team that stole this draft was the Chicago Bears. They will get 5 players that will eventually be a part of the Bears dynasty run, or dynastic possible run that never turned out to be. It was phenomenal. Obviously, everyone remembers 83 for the quarterback class, but you had Kurt Warner, you had Eric Dickerson, you had Greg Bell, I believe, got drafted later in that draft. You have, obviously, like I said, the quarterbacks. You had James Weilander, you had Freeman McNeil, you had Gerald Riggs. The list goes on. So the 1983 season, people are kind of taking a seat back and they're going, okay, what's going to happen? People acknowledge the Redskins had arrived the year before. They were 7-1 and won the Super Bowl. This time they would go 14-2 and set all kinds of records, and everyone knew how good the Redskins were. The 49ers struggled to win the West, barely edged out the Rams, but they won the West. The Detroit Lions would win the North, albeit barely. And then your wild card teams in 83 was the Rams and the Cowboys. And the Rams had gone 9-7, and they really had some pretty good runs, especially to start the year. At one point, they were 5-2 before they, struggled down the stretch. But of course, that season was the season the Rams got to the playoffs, the last game of the season with a field goal as time expired against the Saints in the Louisiana Superdome, 26-24. And I find it funny because, again, the Rams seem to handle the crowd noise just fine, thank you. But they get to the playoffs and eliminate the Saints because whoever won that game was going to go to the wild card game and play the Cowboys. Now, the AFC breaks down really simply. The Raiders are not the number one team, or are they? Yeah, they're 12-4, as are the Miami Dolphins, led by rookie quarterback Dan Marino, rookie quarterback John Elway in Denver, helps lead them to a wild card. Pittsburgh wins the North. Seattle's the other wild card, and there you have it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Mm-hmm. And then the Browns just barely missed the playoffs, losing out to the Steelers, who had won the division. Now, the wild card game is between Seattle and Denver, and Seattle annihilates the Denver Broncos to advance and go to Miami. The Steelers and Raiders have to play each other, and the Raiders handle the Steelers. So second year in a row, Pittsburgh made the playoffs in this decade, 82 and 83. But second year in a row, they're one and done. And then, of course, Miami gets upset by Seattle, and it's Seattle against the Raiders. Seattle had beaten the Raiders twice that year. Things were looking pretty bleak. For the Rams, it's a little bit different. The Rams beat Dallas in an upset of biblical proportion in Dallas in a very cold afternoon. They beat the Dallas Cowboys to advance to the divisional playoff game, which means the 49ers have to play the Lions. Murray misses a 55-yard field goal at the end of the game that would have won it for Detroit, but instead they lose. San Francisco goes on to the NFC Championship game. The Rams were never even in the building. Worst defeat in franchise history in the postseason. It pains me to repeat the score, but the Redskins owned them 51-7 to advance to the championship game. Now, in the championship game, I already showed you the tape of that. The most controversial championship game in NFL history. Two really bad calls won it for the Washington Redskins. More controversial than the Ram game, because there's no question both those penalties shouldn't have been called. Both those penalties were questionable, and both those penalties led to the 49ers losing 24-21. They were down 21-0 and came back to tie it when the BS started, and Washington goes on to the Super Bowl. The Raiders inexplicably blow out Seattle to go to the Super Bowl, and then in the Super Bowl, in one of the biggest upsets of all time, blows out the Washington Redskins. So the Raiders appear to be back. 2 Super Bowls in this decade. They had gone to 2 Super Bowls prior to the 80s, one in the 60s, one in the 70s, and only won one of them. Now they're 2-0 in the Super Bowl, and people are like, well, the Raiders are the greatest franchise in the NFL, and many people had tipped their hat for them to be so. So then we move on to the 1984 season. And 1984 was really a vengeful year for both Miami and San Francisco. Now, it should be noted here that the Rams are an improved football team. They go from 9-7 to 10-6, and they look good in doing it. The Bears, who after that draft year in 1984 dramatically improved, and Bill Parcells, there was talk of firing him after the 83 season when they went 3-13, now had led the New York Giants inexplicably to the playoffs. It was a crazy year. Crazy in the sense that the Broncos were 13-3 and the 2 seed. The Dolphins were 14-2 and the 1 seed. Pittsburgh had won the North at 9-7, and Seattle and Oakland had won the wild card games respectively. So a lot of people were like, okay, it's obviously going to be Denver against Miami. But it didn't turn out to be that, and I'll get to that in a minute. In the NFC, the 49ers ruled the roost at 15-1. Now, Chicago would win the North at 10-6, 11-5, I think they were 10-6. But they won the North for the first time since 79, or the Central. The Giants had won the wild card. The Redskins had won the division 11-5. The last game of the season, the Redskins played the Cardinals and won with a Mosley field goal at the end to put the Washington Redskins in the playoffs. If they had missed that field goal, a lot of things would have went down. The Giants would have been eliminated from the playoffs. The Cardinals would have been in, and the Cowboys would have been in. Instead, he makes the field goal. It keeps the Giants in the playoffs. I'm sorry. Take that back. No, that's right. Instead, he makes the field goal. Cardinals are in or out. Giants and Redskins are in. So the wild card game is New York at LA, and the Rams are heavily favored, but the Giants pull the upset. Poor performance all day long with turnovers, haunts the Rams, a couple of missed opportunities, and credit the Giants, they beat them. In the AFC wildcard, Seattle beats the Raiders in a close game, but nonetheless advance, and Miami gets its rematch, which means Pittsburgh has to go to Denver. And Pittsburgh is not even thought to be in the ball game, let alone this game. But Pittsburgh wins it, pulls a tremendous upset, I believe 24-21, to go on to the AFC Championship game. Miami destroys Seattle to advance to the AFC Championship game. And Dan Marino, in his second year, has Miami in the championship game and gets to go up against his boyhood team, the team he grew up rooting for. In the NFC, the Redskins have to play the Bears at home, and it's the first time in Joe Gibbs' career he's going to lose a home playoff game. Huge upset with Chicago. Willie Gault has a big day. Jim McMahon or Fuller looks good, and the Bears win it. And they pull the upset, and they go to the championship game against, well, the 49ers, because they played the Giants and handled Bill Parcells' young New York team that was still trying to figure its way out. They were getting better, but they weren't there yet. They still hadn't discovered Joe Morris and Mark Bavaro. So the 49ers, or the Giants offensively, are very anemic. Baker's about their only threat, and Carpenter, who's a good fullback, should not be your featured back. So the 49ers play the Bears, the Dolphins play the Steelers. Now, 45-28 was the final score to the AFC Championship game. If you like offense, go watch that game. It's phenomenal. The 49ers and Bears, they play in this epic back and forth game for about a quarter and a half, and then the 49ers take control and they never lose it. They end up winning 23-20 to go on to the Super Bowl. Now, throughout 84, there are a lot of really good games, mainly by a lot of different teams, but the Rams have this great game against the Giants where they get several field goals or safeties. The Dolphins, Dan Marino's breaking all kinds of record. Of course, 84 is the year ED rushed for 2,105 yards. And of course, Joe Montana is Joe Montana at his finest in 84. And the 49ers end up beating the Miami Dolphins in the Super Bowl rather handily. And again, people were expecting a really good football game and just didn't get it. But you're starting to see this power shift. They're starting to be these same teams in the playoffs every year. And it's going to happen again. Now, 85 is the midpoint, and this is where I'm going to end this video after I cover the 85 season. Actually, I'm going to end here. I'm not going to cover the 85 season, but I want you to understand that in 84, the framework was set. In the NFC, the same teams in the NFC, the same four teams, really the same five teams, are going to start popping up. The 49ers, the Rams, the Bears, the Giants, and the Redskins. Now, you're going to have an occasional different team sprinkled in there, but by and large, those five teams are going to be making the playoffs pretty consistently until the end of the decade when things get shifted. In the AFC, a lot of people are like, well, this is it, right? The Raiders are dominant. They made it every single year but 1980. But 1981. The Dolphins are consistent. They've been in it pretty much every year. So this first half of the decade, it looks like it's Raiders, Dolphins. One could argue Seattle. And Denver looks like they're starting to become a thing. As it turns out, when the decade wraps up, there was one team that had made the playoffs twice in the first 3 years and were kind of in it in 83 that people forgot about that would eventually become one of the dominant AFC teams. So, and their teams, no one saw coming. Denver is a team people kind of saw coming slowly, but it was neat because Denver was new. It was fresh. It was brand new. So we've covered the first 5 years of the 1980s, and I haven't even got to why this is the best decade of all time yet. Several great games in those first 5 years to look at, 80 through 84. Take a look at them. They're amazing. The first half of the decade, if you will, is chock full of great offense, great defense, surprises. Take a look at it. I think you guys will enjoy it. Hope you like this show. I'm going to do the second half of the 80s next. But again, the other show that's going to be posted today is me and Eric doing our show. Hope you guys enjoyed it. And thanks for watching. Love the subscribers. Thanks for subscribing. And you guys have a wonderful day. And I hope you enjoy this little bit of 1980s history lesson.